And welcome to Healing X Outreach Radio. I am your host, Augustine Estacio. That is Hillsong United. The name of the song is King of Heaven. And you can get songs like that. You go on CYIWorldwide.com or go on worshiptogether.com. And not only can you get at worshiptogether.com free songs like that, you can also get sheet music. So if you are a worship leader or if you want to give something to your worship leader in your church, worshiptogether.com gives you free lead sheets on such songs like that you can inculcate in your worship in your church. The next couple of weeks, we're going to be having afternoon shows, and this is really good for those of you on the West Coast because we normally do a 9 a.m. Eastern Time air, and so now you guys, you don't have to wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning to hear some of these shows or wait till the podcast comes on. You'll be able to listen at a decent time. So next week we're going to have Bill Bowen from SilentLambs.org. He's the director there, and exposing pedophiles in the cults as well as in the Catholic Church, and trying to protect children. And then at 1 o'clock on the 29th of this month, we have a debate with Dr. Dale Tuggy versus Catholic apologist William Albrecht. Was Tertullian a Trinitarian? So that's going to be a very interesting 2-hour debate that we'll have also at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. We are having a special Saturday. We call it Back-to-Back Bock Saturday, or some might say Bock-to-Bock. We have a special guest, Dr. Darrell Bock, and immediately after this program at 3 o'clock, if you still haven't got enough of Dr. Darrell Bock and you want more, go to Deeper Waters. That's Nick Peters' Deeper Waters radio program. And on Blog Talk Radio, you'll find that under Minister Grock's Association of Ministries. We are working with Minister Grock as a sister ministry. And so go to www.blogtalkradio.com/Grock558, and you will see on there on the list of upcoming programs, Deeper Waters. And so we encourage you, as soon as this program ends, go ahead and get another hour in of Dr. Bock, and he's going to be discussing another subject there from us. So it'll be something different and something new also. So without further ado, I want to introduce our guest. He's the New Testament professor there at Dallas Theological Seminary, and he got his PhD from the University of Aberdeen. And so welcome to the show, Dr. Bock.
Well, it's good to be with you, and I hope you're having a nice day today.
Yes, we are having a nice day, especially when we can get great guests like yourself on. I was reading your book, Blasphemy and Exaltation in Judaism, which is the topic for discussion today. But I want to learn a little bit about you. This is largely a testimonial show. If you're not familiar with the show, Healing X Outreach is where we get ex-cultists to share their stories of coming to faith in Christianity, or in that case, when I have a guest, I always have them share either how they became Christians, or maybe they were raised in the Christian faith, a little bit about their background. Can you tell us a little bit about your upbringing? Were you raised a Christian, or did you come to Christ?
No, I came to Christ. I wasn't raised a Christian. I came to Christ in college, and part of a long, probably 5-year process from the first time hearing the gospel message to the time of welcoming it by faith. And so I grew up through my high school years as an agnostic and used to ask a lot of skeptical questions about Scripture. This explains kind of my latest book called Truth Matters, which I've written with Andreas Kostenberger and Josh Schatrow, and it is dealing with skeptical questions people raise about the Bible. And so out of that background, through really the testimony and life of several believers, I was led to the Lord between my freshman and sophomore year in college.
Well, that's great. I love it when agnostics or atheists come to faith in Christ, because I think that's probably a far more deeper leap, or than actually coming out of the delusion of the cults. Because at least when you come out of the cults, me being a former cultist, you do still have a sense of spirituality, and so it may not be such a leap. But unfortunately, a lot of people that come out of the cults do become agnostics and atheists because of their idea of Christianity being associated so much with their, at least the perception is that they associate Christianity with what they came out of, and of course that becomes a delusion for them that they carry with them. So I definitely want to discuss this book today. What prompted me to call you about this book was actually you were a Unitarian was reading your book, and someone that I know was a Unitarian who has done debate on this program, and he's actually taking some allusions from your book about I guess he's really trying to approach your book from the idea of henotheism, that God has a second God, and I know Mark chapter 14 is such a section of the Gospels that really enforces the deity of Christ. I think more so than a lot of other texts in the synoptics. And so I wanted you to tell us a little bit about what brought you to writing this book, and I've read a great deal of it, and how there were various views about, for example, the charge of being held against Jesus. Was it really blasphemy or not? And why did the Pharisees then, if it was blasphemy, turn them over to the Roman authorities? I mean, wouldn't blasphemy be a charge worthy of public stoning, as it was the case? And also, what encompasses blasphemy as a charge? I know that for the most part, when apologists discuss blasphemy, and in the case with Jesus, they're making a reference towards his own claims to divinity. But there are other charges worthy of blasphemy, from what I read in your book.
Yeah, it's what caused me to write the book was I did a festschrift piece for my doctoral advisor, Howard Marshall, years ago. This would have been in the early 90s, and in it I explored this particular saying. And in writing that piece, just talking about this passage alone in Mark, I decided that really what needed to be done was to sit down and work through Jewish materials, starting from Genesis and going all the way through to the Talmud, on two themes, blasphemy and exaltation. Because in that scene, this is the scene where Jesus, before the Jewish leadership and Caiaphas asked him if he's really the Christ. In this scene, when Jesus replies that you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power coming on the clouds of heaven, we really see the collision between two views. The Jewish leadership thinks that Jesus is blasphemed by equating himself with God in some sense. And Jesus is making a declaration of exaltation by God, but not just any kind of exaltation, not just an exaltation to heaven, but an exaltation to share in his rule, which is what it means to sit at his right hand.
Right.
And so it runs into the Jewish view that who can share glory and rule and placement in heaven with God. That's the issue that's raised, and that's why the Jewish leadership reacts, because they get the point. They don't believe it, but they get the point, and so they accuse Jesus of blasphemy. So I compare it to two trains heading on one track in opposite directions that eventually collide. One's the blasphemy train, the other is the exaltation train, and what we see in this scene is the collision between two worldviews about how to view what's going on. So that's the core of the scene, and I think the best way to proceed through it is to just kind of go a question at a time. So I'll let you follow up in whatever direction you want.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot here. I mean, there's a lot of detail, and what you just said as far as the claims that Jesus made, each one you dissect, and I think you do it very well in this book. For example, you talked about being seated at the right hand, and then you go through certain figures that that were seated, but of course, what does it mean to be sitting? and of course, in association with the right hand of God. And you go through various figures, angelic figures, that are found, not sitting at the right hand of God. They were seated, but probably not in the extent of what Jesus is describing, which is a lot more specific. And what does sitting involve as opposed to standing? And so, and you talk about Metatron and also the
I can walk through these texts because they do help us with this conversation. The issue for someone coming out of Second Temple Judaism in the first century is that there was a discussion about whether or not anyone was capable of having this kind of pictured intimate relationship with God. And the reason I say pictured, of course, is that God doesn't exist in the local space, and you don't sit with him anywhere, and there's no chair that he sits in. So this is all figurative, rhetorical language that we're getting, but it's communicating something. Well, in Judaism, in Second Temple Judaism, there was a debate between different factions about whether or not this was even possible or not. The first text that indicates this is a text called the Exegoge of Ezekiel, also known as the Ezekiel, the Tragedian. It's a pseudepigraphical text written between the period of the two testaments. And in it, Moses has a dream where God invites him to sit on the thrones of heaven. That's plural, and there's only one place in the Hebrew Scripture where thrones is plural, and that's in Daniel 7. And so we're already into the picture association with the Son of Man. And so Moses is invited to sit on the thrones of heaven, and he doesn't understand the dream that he's had. So Jethro, who interprets all things Mosaic, is tasked with explaining what it is that Moses has seen. And Jethro explains to him that he is being given an authority to really represent God very, very directly by what he says. Most people think the book, Ezekiel the Tragedian, is a midrash or an interpretation of Exodus 7:1. Exodus 7:1 has God say to Moses, I will make you God to Pharaoh. And if you look at it in the Hebrew, because sometimes in the English the translation is obscured, the English translations all often read it, I will make you like God to Pharaoh. But the Hebrew actually says it more directly, I will make you God to Pharaoh. And the point is, you're such a mouthpiece for God's program and will when you speak to Pharaoh and speak out, the judgments of the plagues, that it's as good as God being in the room and speaking to Pharaoh. So this is not, it doesn't say anything about the person of Moses. It does say very much about the authority with which Moses works. So that's the first text, and that's one example. The second example is a more fascinating one. It comes from a work known as First Enoch. Actually comes from the Similitudes of First Enoch, another pseudepigraphical text, a book whose date is debated as to whether it predates the time of Jesus' ministry or not. A lot of people think it doesn't predate Jesus because we never found a copy of this section of First Enoch at the Dead Sea Scroll community in Qumran. But the latest event referred to in the text is an event from 40 B.C., and we think the reason it wasn't found at Qumran, at least some people do, is because Qumran had their eschatological teacher about future things. That was the teacher of righteousness, so they didn't want a book that went in a different direction. Anyway, this text has a figure called the Son of Man. The Son of Man is pre-existent. The Son of Man sits on a throne next to God. The Son of Man helps God execute the judgment in the eschaton. It's a figure very, very close in picture to what we see in the New Testament. And in fact, Jesus' favorite name for himself in the Gospels is Son of Man. This text, we think, was circulating in Galilee during the time of Jesus' ministry, so that when he said Son of Man, not only would there have been an allusion to Daniel 7, which is where it comes from, but also perhaps an awareness of this discussion of this figure in the similitudes of First Enoch. So that's a second yes vote. It's a more exalted description and a more comprehensive description of this figure who sits than the Moses text that I mentioned first. So it's a fascinating text. So those were two yes votes. This is possible for a human being to sit with God, and it indicates a close relationship with the expression of the will of God. In the case of the Son of Man, someone who operates almost like a co-regent in performing the works of God. But there are no votes in Judaism, and there are other texts that show this. One of them is a text involving Akiba the rabbi, who believed that David was the figure who was going to be seated next to God on the basis of Psalm 110:1. And he believed that David was seated at the right hand. And the rabbis responded to this interpretation by Akiba by saying, how long will you blaspheme the Shekinah, which is a Jewish way of accusing him of blasphemy? What you did in Judaism when someone blasphemed is you warned them once, and then the second time they were responsible for having blasphemed. And so this is the warning, that they reject the interpretation, and it's a signal that there's a no vote from some. The fourth text in this discussion is a text from 3rd Enoch. Now, this is written a little later than our time. It's the latter part of the 1st century A.D. But in it, Metatron gives Enoch a tour of heaven and refers to himself as the lesser Yahweh, and ends up being punished in the book for having suggested that he could even be somewhat equated with Yahweh. A very strong no vote on the idea of being with God in heaven and being associated with him. Now, the important feature about that is to show this was an issue that was discussed in Second Temple Judaism, but there's one more important factor that factors into the scene, and that is that the bulk of the Sanhedrin, the bulk of the Jewish council that's examining Jesus, they were Sadducees. Sadducees did not believe in the expansion of Old Testament tradition. In fact, they were focused on the Torah. They even had trouble with the writings and the prophets. And so they would have been very close and had a very negative view of these traditions in Judaism that permitted this kind of view of God. And they controlled the Sanhedrin. They were the majority of the Sanhedrin. So this reaction to this claim by Jesus that we're getting from the Sadducees fits what we know about Sadducean theology. So that's I'm sorry that took so long, but that's the full background that is informing the passage.
In fact, that's interesting because I thought that only Pharisees were at the trial, but what you just said was enlightening about the Sadducees being there.
In fact, the Sadducees controlled the Jewish scene in Judea until the war that brought down the temple, and then the Pharisees became the majority figures. The Pharisees are the majority figures in the Gospels because they're the ones who are initially watching what Jesus is doing and saying. But once Jesus goes to Judea, it's the Sadducees who are the main opponents.
Now, since the Sadducees are the main opponents there, why would the high priest Caiaphas, he was clearly a Pharisee, why would he react the way he did?
Actually, no, he was probably in all likelihood a Sadducee. He would have been, the Sadducees were the wealthy, upper class people who, and the Sadducees controlled the council during this time. So Caiaphas, Annas, his family, they would have been Sadducees. Like I said, the Pharisees didn't come to control Judaism until after the fall of Jerusalem in A.D. 70. The big loser in that war with Rome were the Sadducees.
Wow, that's interesting. Wow, I had no idea. That really explains a lot then as to why the charge, because apparently the Pharisees were more open towards an exalted figure in Judaism, and I think that's what, as a Trinitarian, that's what many of my Unitarian opponents have basically explained, was that they reject the Pharisaical view. They believe that it's something that was derived from the Hellenistic period and under Greek philosophical influence.
Absolutely wrong. The Pharisees held to a bodily resurrection from very early on. They reacted to Hellenism and were open to resurrection. The reason the Sadducees had trouble with exaltation and resurrection is that they rejected the idea of a physical resurrection, and so that's where the Pharisees and the Sadducees differed. So when Jesus makes this claim of exaltation, which assumes a resurrection as a part of it, a physical resurrection as a part of it, he is challenging directly Sadducean theology. And of course, if you'll remember, before we get to the trial, the Sadducees asked Jesus directly about the hope of resurrection, and he cites the remark of God at the bush about, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as a way of justifying from the Pentateuch that there is a resurrection by saying, I'm a God of the living and not a God of the dead.
Wow. Yeah, he did. So I was just thinking about, that explains a lot about what Josephus writes about the Sadducees and why this trial was taking place by night, because I think Josephus says that the Sadducees were pretty much an unscrupulous bunch. And while it also explains why Jesus... I tend not to follow the line of interpretation that says that what is going on here is kind of a violation of all kinds of capital trial trial processes, because this is a special situation. They've got to get Jesus to Pilate. They want Rome to crucify Jesus. They don't want to be responsible for Jesus' death. If Rome crucifies Jesus, then they can simply say, look, we just did our civic duty. Rome made the call. They're the ones who issued the verdict. They crucified him. Don't blame us. And so that gets them off the hook. And so this meeting with Jesus, even though it's often called a trial, technically speaking, it's not a trial. It's more like a grand jury investigation, where we're gathering the evidence that we're going to take to Rome. And the other thing is that they've absolutely got to get this right. If they take Jesus to Pilate and Pilate examines him and Pilate lets him go, they've got a whole other public relations problem on their hands. So they're being very careful about how they go about this. The text says that they gathered false witnesses, and that has to do with how they exaggerated, for example, what Jesus had to say about the destruction of the temple and that kind of thing. But in the end, they didn't take that charge to Pilate because they couldn't prove it. And so in the end, what actually takes Jesus to Pilate is this reply that he makes to the high priest, claiming to be exalted to the right hand of God, which they read as an offense against God, but they can't take the charge of blasphemy to Pilate. Pilate won't care whether Jesus has blasphemed the Jewish God, Jewish perception of God or not. What they do is they translate Jesus' reply into a political charge. And so when he answers saying "I am" in response to the Christ, or "you say so," depending on which version you're reading, which is a veiled form of a positive reply, he is accepting the category of being King of the Jews, and they can translate that into a political charge, which they take to Pilate. And then from there, we read the account in front of Pilate, and he eventually ends up being crucified. So the one who's responsible for the testimony that sends Jesus to the cross, ironically enough, is actually Jesus' own testimony himself. Yeah, because they took it as a challenge to Caesar.
They translate it for Pilate as a challenge to Caesar. Of course, their offense is at the fact that Jesus could equate himself with God, and that gets us into the Christology of the remark and also the implications for Trinitarianism. Right.
I don't know if, and when I read your book, it reminded me of another book that I've read earlier this year, and I don't know if you've read Daniel Boyarin, who's actually an Orthodox Jew from Cal Berkeley, and in the Jewish Gospels, and he talks about the Son of Man title, and when I read that book, I was just astounded at how here a Jew is telling us, an Orthodox Jew today, is telling us how the title, the appellation of Son of Man, is actually a stronger attribution to divinity than actually Son of God, at least within Second Temple Judaism it would have been. And so
that's
and
correct.
That's one of,
and it reflects this debate that we saw of the text that I went through. The text that I went through reflect a debate in Judaism known as the two powers of God debate.
Right.
And, is there one power of God or is there two powers of God? Does God share his authority? And the reason the Son of Man appellation is such a high exalted title is the Son of Man is a human being. Okay, that's what Son of Man means, son of a human being. Just like you would say, son of Jane is Jane's son, and son of Charles is Charles' son. Son of a man is a son of a human being. So this is a human being, but this human being rides the clouds. And when you ride the clouds in the Old Testament, you're doing something deity does. That's something only deity does. And so the reason Jesus liked this title, I think, so much is it has this wonderful mix of humanity and deity all wrapped up in one package. It's like a DNA piece of DNA. It's a double helix. It's all wrapped up into itself, and so that's what you're seeing. So Jesus' claim to be the Son of Man, and drawing on the imagery of Daniel 7, which is where he gets the title from, and that's the imagery. The Son of Man rides the clouds. Is this mixture of humanity and deity? And Boyarin's book is a discussion of the history of this two powers in heaven discussion that took place in Judaism. And the texts that I mentioned just a few minutes ago are the key texts that fuel this conversation within Second Temple Judaism.
Right. Yeah, and Boyarin actually, he says that this would be understood as, the little Yahoo or the younger Yahoo, being not only a binatarian relationship, but also, and he uses the word binatarian, which was shocking to me coming from an Orthodox Jew. But he says
he's reading the text for what they're affirming. He doesn't believe it, but he's reading the text for what they're affirming. And that's I actually think the core of New Testament Christology comes from, in part, and as a result of some of the things that Jesus is teaching in some of these texts, because what he is communicating is, on the one hand, a vindication by the Father of the one he has sent, but secondly, an equation between who this incarnated figure is and deity and divine authority. If you ask the basic question, who gets to sit with God in heaven if God is one and no one shares his glory? Okay,
right. Then
you're into the Trinity, because the only person who can share the glory of God is God.
Right.
And that is the point. So Unitarians who are trying to argue that this is a two-God theology really miss the point here. These are Jewish believers that come out of Judaism. They still hold that God is one, but they also give God the right to express his presence in an incarnation. And that's what you have with Jesus Christ. That's what John is saying when he says the Word was God and the Word became flesh. That's what he's expressing, is an incarnated divine presence in the person of Jesus. And that is Binitarian.
Right. I think that Unitarians probably, definitely, we're talking about non-Socinian Unitarians, are now making an error by creating the two-God system, because now they're removing themselves from the very strict monotheism that they claim to defend in opposition to Trinitarianism. When they make that mistake, because now they're saying that there's a big God and a little God that can share the glory of the big God, and yet there are express texts that says, Yahweh says that he shall not share his glory with another, and there are express texts where in the Psalms where it talks about that there is no one like unto Yahweh amongst the exalted beings, that is the Elohim. And so if Jesus is either in the classification of simply Elohim, in the classification of other created beings, whether they're angels or men, then the Psalms is condemning Jesus, because Jesus is now claiming to have glory, the same glory of the Father, John 17:11, and so it becomes, I think, I think it becomes that their very position that they're holding to actually condemns them, because they're trying to say that, well, God had exalted figures, and Jesus could be simply another exalted figure, just higher than the other exalted figures. That itself then rejects the monotheism that they say that we reject, and far more.
The key text here for out of Judaism, of course, is the Deuteronomy 6 text, which is repeated every week in the synagogue, and was repeated every week in the synagogue even as early as the first century, what's known as the Shema. And, it's the text that declares, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one." And then, if you think about the opening of the Ten Commandments, you get the same kind of idea. You shall have no other gods before me. You shouldn't worship anyone but Yahweh alone. And so the idea that a Jewish person could respond in worship, which is eventually, of course, what the early church did to Jesus, indicates the status that they're giving to this figure, and the way they're viewing him as a divine figure.
I think your book does definitely it explains that, especially towards the end, and I think on the pages in your conclusion, I think you make in chapter where it talks about blasphemy and the Jewish examination of Jesus in Mark. I think
that's right, and we're trying to, this book is built inductively. We will first walk through blasphemy, then we walk through exaltation, and then we apply everything that we found to this text in Mark 14. And it's when I summarize it that way, it sounds like, oh, well, that wouldn't take very long, but actually it takes over 200 pages to do it.
Yes. Yeah. But you did a very thorough examination, because you went into to Jewish sources, extra biblical sources, and you also went into the Deuterocanonicals. I just thought it was a very thorough examination, and you basically took everyone's opinions, and then towards the end, when you would conclude on it, you would make a conclusion based upon the various opinions that you had. I just want to make sure that our listeners get a chance to comment or talk to you, so I want to let our listeners know we're coming down to the last 20 minutes of the program. So the number is 347-934-0379, and press 1 if you want to share a comment or ask a question of Dr. Bock. And I want to remind our listeners that he will be on immediately after this program on Nick Peters' Deeper Waters, which is also on Blog Talk Radio on Minister Grock's Association of Ministries. So just go to Minister Grock on Blog Talk Radio, and you should be able to hear more about Dr. Bock on the book of Luke, actually. They're going to cover on the Nick Peters show. So Mark, would you say that Mark 14 is probably one of the most powerful expressions of Jesus' divinity, especially because one of the things that I've always talked to Unitarians about is that here Jesus is claiming to be the Son of Man, and look at the reaction that he receives. The tailors in Jerusalem all of a sudden got a lot of business.
All of a sudden have some work. Yeah, exactly. I mean, the whole point here is that the theologians who hear what Jesus is saying get it. They understand what it is that Jesus has done and said. They understand the implications of what it is that Jesus said and done. And I do think Mark 14 is actually one of the most powerful Christological texts in all the New Testament. We think that the way Jesus talked about it, presented himself in his ministry has a lot to do with what he said about himself. And to a certain extent, that's true. This is a saying. But there also is what certain actions, either by Jesus or by God, mean. And that's another way Jesus presented himself. So, for example, when Jesus heals the paralytic and he forgives sins, the reaction of the theologians in the crowd is, who can forgive sins but God alone? They get it. And so there are actions that Jesus performs that involve what I like to call cultural scripts. These are actions that are embedded with meaning, that if someone who lives in the culture understands the meaning that's embedded in the action, sometimes because we're 21 centuries removed from the events and we don't share the culture, we don't get the meaning that's embedded in the event. And when Jesus says he can sit with God in heaven, he's invoking a cultural script. And the cultural script communicates an equation between himself and God, and that's what the leadership reacts to.
Now, I want to discuss a little bit about John chapter 8, verses 56 through 58, and Jesus' I am statements. And I think that was what my Unitarian friend called into question about Jesus' references to I am. And he's seeing these as simply just references to being older than, I guess, the listening Pharisees, and that was a call for blasphemy.
Except in the case of John 8, he's saying, before Abraham was, I am. That. Right. If he's older than the listening Pharisees, he's a lot older than the listening Pharisees.
So he's not equating this as a claim to, I guess, the uncaused cause of the Old Testament, the references that Jesus makes about being I am. But I am is also a reference to eternality.
It's an allusion to the name of God, and so so in that sense, it's a very, very high claim. And in that, there are other passages where Jesus answers I am, and it doesn't have that meaning. But in this context, where you've got before Abraham was, I am, it's pushing hard in that direction. Because what human being standing before you, talking to you, can claim to be older than someone living literally millennia before the people listening? And so it's designed to be a very provocative statement and justification for Jesus' claims of authority that he's making in the midst of this discourse in John 8.
Now, would it be a blasphemous statement if he's just? I think what David Barron is the person I'm speaking of is making a reference to is he thinks that maybe just to claim that he is older than the Pharisees and older than Abraham doesn't make an association of divinity. He could be considered an exalted figure. He could be an angel.
That actually is true. It does allow that kind of space. But the problem is when you juxtapose it with the very name of God himself and you create that illusion, then you've done something in addition that is pushing hard in a certain direction. It's, like I said, it's designed to be provocative. It's not explicit, it's implicit. And that ambiguity is part of what Jesus is doing to try and get them to think. And so, if you think about someone being that old, it's pushing the question of, okay, then how old is he really?
Right. Yeah. And the fact that he is using ego eimi is clear. It's not just that he's older or older in the sense of an angelic figure, but he's older in association with Exodus 3:14 and
exactly. It's an allusion to Exodus 3:14, and that is the place where God names himself. So actually, if I say that before Abraham was, my name was the name of God.
Yeah. And I've also seen it, used, also I think in the book of Deuteronomy as a distinguishing where God tells Israel that basically that they have worshipped devils and not God. We do have a caller who has just pressed 1, and so I'm gonna let them. Caller 214, you are on the air with Dr. Darrell Bock.
Hi, Gus. Hi, Dr. Bock. How you doing? It's Dave Barron.
I'm doing great, thanks.
Great. I got to tune into the show just a few minutes ago, and my name popped up, so I figured, well, what the heck, I'll go ahead and make a call. I appreciated some of the discussion that I've heard so far. Unfortunately, like I said, it's been very, limited as to what I've been able to hear. One of the things I kind of wanted to discuss briefly was the notion that I am is actually a name for God, and I don't believe we actually find that anywhere in the Second Temple literature or in the New or Old Testament.
So what do you do with Exodus 3:14? I am that I am.
Well, I mean, first of all, we're dealing with there's quite a volume of literature on how we should actually translate the verb there. Even the Septuagint doesn't actually read that way. But a common and among scholars rendering and a popular rendering is even I will be who I will be, or I will be what I will be. And so there's, I think, real question at that point as to, that's being used in such a way. And two, remember that when God actually affirms what his name is, he uses the tetragrammaton at that point. So he says, "This is my name forever."
Yeah, well, you can't have this both ways. I mean, he's answering the question about what he's going to be called in Exodus 3. What is his name? What should I say to them? God said to Moses, "I am that I am." He said, "You must say this to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you." And then it goes on to say, "You must say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, a God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever. This is my memorial from generation to generation." He's not distinguishing between the name Lord and whatever I am is. He is equating the two categories and the two appellations. So I don't think you say, well, his initial answer to the question doesn't count. The second answer to the question is the answer to his question. He's actually giving Moses a lot to say about who it is that has sent him.
Well, and yeah, I mean, I don't, in large, I don't agree with that, but I think the question becomes is AA there actually the name itself or an explanation of his name? I mean, we never
make any difference. It doesn't make any difference, even if it's an explanation of his name. Okay, let's assume that it's an explanation of his name. The explanation points to the name and points to the person.
But is AA ever used as a name for God anywhere? And I know of no text.
Well, then the John text is the issue. The John text is the issue.
Now we're dealing with eimi.
Think about it. Just think about it for a second, okay?
Okay.
Because this is an illusion.
Okay.
Before Abraham was, I am. What else does that mean?
Well, I mean, if we follow Kenneth McKay, for example, in his exposition or his view on the text in the expository times, he, and I would agree with this, views it as a present of past action in the verb, so that he's affirming his existence prior to Abraham, not only existing prior, but then continuously he's affirming his existence up until that very time.
Okay, and that's actually what I said earlier. Okay, what I said earlier is that this is not in and of itself a direct declaration of deity. What it is to say that I, the human being standing before you, have existed literally for millennia. Now, once you start to push in that direction, okay, then you've made a point about how long the existence is. How many humans live that long? Not many. And so you're obviously narrowing down the category that you're dealing with. And what's interesting is that when this happens in John, when we get to Jesus uttering this in this way, the response that we're getting is a response of offense. Okay, and the offense is not something you'd react to if Jesus were merely claiming to be some type of heavenly being visiting the earth. Okay, the offense is directly related to the idea that he is blasphemed. I mean, verse 59 says, "Then they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple area." They're picking up stones because they view it as blasphemy. You don't blaspheme if you merely present yourself as a transcendent being. So the idea that there are no texts that do this is actually technically probably incorrect. This text is doing that. You see it by the reaction. And then the question is, there may or may not be other texts that do that. That we could perhaps discuss and debate. But this text appears to be doing that.
Okay, so I guess where I'm a little bit confused, and maybe I just didn't follow your initial comments correctly, and so maybe you can clarify for me. Is where you seem to be saying, like you just did, that it is a claim to be a heavenly being, but then when you also make reference to to I am as the name of God, I guess I'm not clear how you see this all fitting together here.
I see this fitting together because I take what Jesus says and the reaction of the crowd as telling me that that's the illusion, that what we have is an implicit claim, not an explicit claim, and that when they have a human being standing before them who claims to be thousands of years old, and we know that the claim to simply be an angelic visitor is not an act of blasphemy, okay? The audience puts together what it is that Jesus is doing and saying, and John presents the story that way, and that's how we're supposed to see it. Remember that John has already framed this story in an introduction to a gospel in which he has made the claim that Jesus is God. He's done it from the very first verses. So this is narratively framed in this way and presented in this way, and the crowd is reacting in this way.
So do you view this then as this single statement of ego eimi as the entire issue, or would you see it as a culmination where
Well, it's a combination of things. It's a combination of things that are doing it. It's not. That's why I said it's implicit rather than explicit.
May I interject real quick? Is that possibly why? Because the ego eimi is in verse 24, and I think it's also in verse 27 or 28, and then Jesus in verse 56, I think, or 57 is where he then makes an association with his ego eimi in association with the age of Abraham. That's the first time he does that, and then all of a sudden, I think it seems like they didn't get it, verse 24, they didn't get it in verse 27, when Jesus becomes more explicit what he's associating ego eimi with in towards the end of the chapter. Then they realize this guy is claiming something blasphemous.
Well, I think your observation's interesting, because even though I don't think verse 24, I don't think verse 24 is the same kind of an I am statement that we're getting in later on in the chapter. But when he talks about what he is doing being inseparable from what he's heard from the Father in verse 26, John makes this side remark in verse 27. They did not understand he was telling them about his Father, and that's the father-sonship relationship, and John's pushing now in this direction. But again, we are, the debate that we're having in this section is that Jesus is claiming to be from above and not from below, and so he's claiming to be from heaven and have a heavenly origin, have heavenly roots. He's not just claiming to be a transcendent being, okay?
Right.
He's claiming to have a unique relationship to the Father, what John calls the only begotten Son. There's no one else like him. And so that's the conversation that's feeding into this illusion at the end of the chapter. By the way, if you go to the LXX, you mentioned the LXX in Exodus 3:14, what you get is a prepositional phrase saying, I am the one who is, okay? It's a definite article with a present participle, which is simply a different way to talk about I am. In fact, that in the Septuagint, that reply begins ego eimi hon on, which is I am the one who is, and that's where the illusion is.
So, but if it's supposed to, there's a lot there. If that's supposed to be a name, though, that seems to move away from that.
How can it not be a name? It's answering the question in Exodus 3:13. What name? What is his name? What should I say to them? That's what Moses asked God before we get to verse 14.
I understand that, but what I'm referring to the specific language. For example, when somebody has a name, you don't change.
The language
you don't
is
change
specific.
the word, but if my name is eimi, I don't say eimi haon. I say eimi.
If your name is, we'll use the King of England. If your name is George Albert Charles Windsor, and you say my name is George, do you have to go through the rest of the line to say who you are?
No, because George is part of your name. But at this point, Jesus is not using he could have said ego, or he could have said haon, or God could have said something to that effect. My point is he's using completely different words. You can't substitute completely different words in a name.
He's not using completely different words.
He's using the participial form. I grant that.
First of all, we're working with the translation when we talk about the Septuagint. Okay,
right.
So that's the first thing. So we're already moving. We're moving from Hebrew to Greek. So
right.
So we're already in a translated mode. The passage in Exodus is a response to this question. If I go to the Israelites and tell them the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what should I say to them? Said to Moses, I am the one who is. Okay? Or you could say that would be a very literal translation of the Greek. Okay? I am the one who is. Okay? So Jesus answers, before Abraham, in John 8, before Abraham was, I am. Then he says this in Exodus 3:14 after he says, I am the one who is. You must say this, or thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, the one who is has sent me to you. And God said to Moses, you must say this to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. He's basically repeating the line in Hebrew parallelism. I am has sent me to you. The Lord has sent me to you, which actually reflects the parallelism of Moses' question, which starts off, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and then what is his name? I am has sent me to you. So the reply by God mirrors the question of Moses. And the answer that we're getting, I don't care whether we call it a name or an explanation of the name. That, to me, doesn't make any difference at all, is what Moses is told to say to the Israelites that identifies who it is that has sent Moses.
On that, I got to send you on your way, Dr. Bock. I want to make sure that you're on time for Nick Peters' show at Deeper Waters.
Okay, thanks, Augustine.
I want to thank you for coming on the program, I'll tell you, the book is kind of pricey, but because I had to get it through.
Well, the book's pricey. Is it out of print? The book is pricey in the German version. The Erdman's the Baker paperback version is not so expensive.
Oh, okay.
So if you get it through Baker, it's actually, I think, a normal price of a normal book. But the German version, this is originally in the European New Testament series, was very, very expensive. Because it's printed with a limited printing, and usually only libraries buy it, and a handful of scholars. And scholars aren't normally rich, but they shell out the money for a book like this.
Yeah, I think I got it for a steal at $45, but it's a great wealth of information. So I just want to let our listeners go and let you know that if you're going to listen to Deeper Waters, I want to give you the number there, and the call-in number, and I'm sure that you have it, Dr. Bock, is 347-202-0241. So go to Deeper Waters, and you can hear more of Dr. Bock. Oh no, here it goes. Here goes the question. Call in for questions at 714. That's 714-242-5180. That's 714-242-5180. And once again, thank you, Dr. Bock, for coming on Healing X Outreach. And next week we have a 1 o'clock program with Bill Bowen and a debate at 1 o'clock also Eastern Time the following week. And so go to Deeper Waters, the Nick Peters Show, and listen to Dr. Bock talk about the book of Luke. Thank you for your ministry. Thank you for what you do in teaching, educating our young pastors for tomorrow. And so without further ado, if you have any questions or comments, please go to healingxoutreach@yahoo.com, and we'll see you next week at 1 o'clock Eastern Time, and we'll hear Bill Bowen from silentlambs.org. You all have a great weekend. Bye-bye.